Thank you all for joining us the morning after the night before. My name is William Lewis, former publisher of the Wall Street Journal and now founder of the news movement, the Social First News Organization. And it's my job to welcome you to this AlixTalks special. We have a number of midterm election results in, and so far it looks like the anticipated Republican red wave has not yet materialized. The control of Congress is unclear as we speak. In this AlixTalks, we'll be exploring the challenges confronting business leaders today, majoring on the implications of these fascinating midterm elections. We know that for those of you on the West Coast, you will just about be surfacing. So we're going to give you a full election briefing, as well as discussing what it is likely to mean for the economy and businesses. Now, I am extremely pleased to be joined by Simon Freakley, CEO of AlixPartners, who is US-based, and Gerry Baker, editor-at-large at the Wall Street Journal, and one of the nation's best-known journalists and political commentators. And please don't be put off by our accents, which may have a slight British lilt. All three of us are either naturalized Americans, live in America, have American families, work in America, love America, and have, of course, been involved in American business and politics closely for a long time. And Gerry, I know you are extremely busy this week dissecting what the midterms mean, so thank you for giving up your time and speaking to us here. Now, before we get stuck in, I want to remind you that you can ask questions of Gerry and Simon by using the chat function below. Please do ask away. I promise to try to get them in. And given that the votes are still being counted, if there is a significant announcement during the course of this session, I will be ringing the story bell and letting you know. So let's dive right in. Gerry, can I come to you first? Let's set the scene. All 435 seats in the House of Representatives were up for election, along with 35 in the Senate. What we know so far, the Democrats have won Pennsylvania. DeSantis has won big in Florida, including in Miami-Dade County, a Democratic stronghold. Can you give us a breakdown of the results, lay out what happened last night, and point a picture as what is likely to happen now?
Thanks, Will. Thank you very much for having me, and thanks everybody for being online. It's good to be with you, Will and Simon. Look forward to a good discussion. I think the headline, just as you said right at the start, Will, is that even as we are into the morning after the night before, or even the night that never ended, because we know now these elections go on and on and on in America, they can never actually get around to completing the process until weeks after the vote. But what the headline is that the widely anticipated Republican significant victory, red wave, red tsunami, whatever you want to call it, has not materialized, and we can say that with some confidence. The latest numbers we have suggest that in the House of Representatives, now the Republicans needed to the position in the House before the election, as I'm sure everybody knows, was Democrats had 222 seats, Republicans had 213, 212, 213, depending how you measure it. So they only needed to gain 5 seats to take a majority in the House. Now, given that we're in a midterm situation, the first presidential midterm of this presidency, given that we have a president who is not very popular by any standards, in an economy that's raising a lot of concerns for people, and people are unhappy, everybody expected the Republicans, as normal, to take achieve a big majority in the House of Representatives. The expectations were that they would gain anywhere between 20 and maybe 30 or even 40 seats in the House of Representatives to take their total up to 230 to 240, as high as maybe into the 240s. They haven't got anywhere near that total. The latest estimates are, and there's still a lot of House races still to be counted, the latest estimates that we've seen from the various network analysis, they're looking at about maybe 220 seats, maybe 221 seats. So a tiny majority, essentially the mirror image of the Democratic majority that we had in 2020, a majority of less than 10 seats. That's a very, very narrow win, a very disappointing performance by the Republicans. In the Senate, as you say, not only have they not so far at least gained any seats in the Senate, again, which would be expected in a midterm year. They've actually lost one. They've lost Pennsylvania that was an open seat held by a retiring Senator Pat Toomey. That's gone to the Democrats in the shape of John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor. There are still opportunities for Republicans to take seats and to get a majority in the Senate. The two key seats that really are very much up in the air at the moment, there are three actually, but the two key ones that are up in the air are Nevada and Arizona. And we are waiting literally as we speak for more results to come in from Arizona. As it stands, the Democrat has a very slight lead in Arizona. That is Mark Kelly, the incumbent senator. In Nevada, the Republican, that's Adam Laxalt, has a slight lead, but there's a lot of votes still to come in. Those votes could change. The one other Senate seat that's still outstanding is Georgia. The one other key Senate seat that's still outstanding really is Georgia. That is where the seat the Democrats hold. Raphael Warnock, the current senator, he's in a tight race with Herschel Walker. There, the key thing is, and it looks very likely, but if you don't get 50% of the vote goes to a runoff in a month's time, December the 6th. So that is very almost certain to go to a runoff. So as we stand, Will, there is still a chance that the Republicans will take control of the Senate, but it's a slim chance now. I think it's slim, and it's weakening. We could be in a situation where Democrats actually, currently, as you know, the Senate is 50-50. Democrats could actually could actually gain one seat because they've already gained Pennsylvania, hold on to the seats they have, and actually increase their effective majority in the Senate. So that, again, either way, it's a very disappointing result for Republicans. And just finally, briefly, as you mentioned, Ron DeSantis, the governor's races, there are 35, 36 Republican races across the country. They were a mixed bag. Democrats held on in a lot of states where they thought they were in trouble. New York, very narrowly, it looks like, which New York is a very blue Democratic state. Kathy Hochul, the governor, does seem to have held on here. Then we have Michigan, also where a not very popular governor has managed to hold on, fend off the Republican. The big story, exactly as you said, of the night is Ron DeSantis in Florida, who not only won Florida, not only won re-election, he won by almost 20 percentage points. That's the largest majority a governor's had there. That state is now a Republican state. Just a reminder, he won governorship 4 years ago by I think by about 25,000 votes. Yesterday, he won Florida by 1.5 million votes. So he's the huge winner out of tonight. I know we'll go on to talk about what it all means in terms of presidential politics and everything else. Ron DeSantis is the big winner. The rest of the Republican Party, to be quite honest with you, not exactly a loser because they've gained the House, but a very disappointing result, way short of the expectations that they had.
Well, that's a great setup, Jerry. So disappointing night, and there's obviously loads to unpack there. Simon, can I come to you? Can you put a business lens on that for us, please? What if you're waking up? You advise lots of CEOs. You're waking up as a CEO this morning. How are you seeing the US now? Businesses want stability and they want it to feel like a stable environment. How are they seeing it today, Simon?
Thanks, Will, and thank you, by the way, and also Jerry for joining the session today. I mean, obviously, as you say, Will, the most important thing for businesses, for business leaders, is stability, an environment in which you can actually forecast and plan. And of course, even though this is a US midterm election, with the US being the largest global economy, it's a very, very important environment for global businesses, not just US businesses. And even though China, of course, has driven probably 40% of global growth over the last 20 years, the US is still the most important economy that we have. So very important indeed for global businesses to have stability. You know, clearly we're in a challenged environment. Generally, we're still clawing our way out of a pandemic. We're facing significant economic headwinds, not just in the US, but in other Western economies around the world. There's a land war in Europe. Whoever would have thought that possible with the invasion of Ukraine and the consequent impact on the supply chains and collateral damage around. So I think it's a very uncertain time for businesses. I think having stability in the major economy of the world is extremely important. So I think as we all wake up to the emerging results this morning, as brilliantly explained by Jerry just now, I think the good news is that there is some stability for businesses to plan around.
Fantastic. Well, let's get into it. I really want to unpack this. It's a really excellent conversation. Jerry, in one of your recent articles, you described the midterms as a signaling device for voters to use to indicate their approval, rejection, of President Biden and the current direction. But it seems from the polling in the run-up to the election that people are very dissatisfied with the economy, with their lot, and with President Biden, but seem to have in large numbers voted for the incumbent as opposed to what does this tell us about what the country feels about President Biden? And more generally, how do you square the anger, concern, and focus on the negative elements of the economy and so on, and the apparent end voting result we're seeing coming in today?
Well, I think that's actually that's a critical question. It's the conundrum really here. Look, the polling we have, as you said, before the election, but even more importantly, the very comprehensive exit poll, very large sample exit poll and voter analysis done by the various networks on the voting on the day and people who voted early, does reflect that great dissatisfaction with the state of the country and great dissatisfaction with the president himself and the Democratic Party in Congress. The president's approval ratings, according to that poll, at about 44%. It's a little bit higher than some of the polls had him, but it's still significantly underwater. That kind of level of support or approval of the president, low level of approval of the president, is normally associated with a pretty significant electoral setback. So there's no question that people disapprove of the president's record. In terms of the state of the country, that same poll shows that more than 2/3 of voters think the country's on the wrong track. Something like 70% of voters are unhappy or even angry with the condition of the country. So there's no question that voters, that we were right before the election to think that voters are very unhappy. They're unhappy with inflation, with the economy. They're unhappy with things like crime and immigration and issues like that. All of these things were expected to favor the Republicans. So what happened? Why didn't the Republicans do what you would normally expect in those circumstances with a very sullen, unhappy electorate would automatically? Remember, the Democrats have been in complete control of the federal government for the last 2 years. They've had the White House and, of course, both the Senate and the House of Representatives. That would normally, you'd expect that to see result in a big vote against the incumbents, but it hasn't. And the answer, I think, we're going to have to look into detail and figure out as we interpret the results and interpret the exit poll and everything else. I do think that the simple answer is, as unhappy as they are with the state of the country, they are not persuaded that the Republican Party is offering a powerful and plausible and acceptable alternative as it stands for them to embrace the Republican Party in its fullness right now. And I think you have to say in a large part of that, and again, this is reflected in some of the detailed results, is concern about the condition of the Republican Party, the message of the Republican Party, and let's be honest, the leadership of the Republican Party. And I think Donald Trump continues to loom very, very large in American politics. He's the dominant figure still in American politics, as dominant at least as Joe Biden. And if you look in particular at the races that we've seen that were declared last night and this morning, where candidates that Donald Trump had backed, many candidates, he backed many candidates across many states, most of them agreed with him and supported him in denying the outcome of the 2020 election, saying the election was stolen from him. He backed many candidates who said that. And many of those, some of those candidates did okay. Many of those candidates did not and actually dragged the party down. New Hampshire is a very good example. The Senate candidate there, Bolduc, for the Republicans, that was a race. That was a close race. The Republicans could have won. In fact, Bolduc ended up losing to the incumbent Democrat Maggie Hassan by a lot. Bolduc had been a passionate election denier. He had been involved in the January the 6th protests and supported the January the 6th protests. He fervently supported Donald Trump in his claims about the election. He went down to a pretty significant defeat. Pennsylvania, the governor's race there, Doug Mastriano, the Republican candidate, up against Josh Shapiro, the Democratic candidate. Mastriano was again an absolute passionate supporter in the Stop the Steal movement, a believer in a supporter of Donald Trump's view that the election was stolen. He went down to a big defeat, probably dragged the Republican candidate for Senate, Dr. Mehmet Oz, down with him. Oz also backed by Trump. Other states, state after state, some of these states, we're going to have to wait and see what happens in Arizona. But those two candidates for governor and senator in Arizona for the Republicans, also strongly backed by Donald Trump. They went down. Now, if you look at other candidates where Trump did not support them particularly, or they tried to distance themselves from Trump, they did much better. The most obvious one is Brian Kemp in Georgia. Georgia, you may remember, everybody on the call may remember, was a scene, of course, after the last election where Donald Trump tried to get Brian Kemp, the governor, and the election officials in Georgia to essentially overturn the election there, which had voted very narrowly for Joe Biden. Kemp refused. Trump was furious. Trump has campaigned heavily against Kemp essentially ever since in the primary and subsequently. Kemp stood his ground. Kemp won comfortably in that election by significantly more again than Herschel Walker, if he does win, the Senate candidate who's backed by Donald Trump in Georgia. He may not win at all. If he does, it'll be very narrow. So there's a pattern here. And by the way, and even in states where Trump candidates did win, and we should say that there were plenty of states where Trump candidates did win, it's not clear that Trump was in any significant way helpful there. I was very struck. J.D. Vance, who's the famous author, wrote Hillbilly Elegy, great successful book, used to be a kind of a mainstream sort of conservative, then became a very strong Trump supporter. This is the Senate candidate in Ohio for the Republicans, backed strongly by Donald Trump, was a very, very, very close ally of Trump. Trump campaigned with him. Interestingly, when he gave his acceptance speech last night, I just saw this, I have to double check it, but somebody said he mentioned 34 names in his acceptance speech, thanking 34 people by name who'd helped him in Ohio. Not one of them was Donald Trump. So I think there is a pattern here emerging that actually Republicans who enjoyed Trump's support, who backed Trump's claims about the 2020 election, who promised to, essentially, to do things that would, if necessary, do everything they could to ensure Donald Trump's election, they didn't do very well. So I think, again, there are many factors and we're going to have to interpret all of them. But so far, at least, that Trump factor seems to be a significant one in terms of how the Republicans underperformed against expectations.
Okay, fascinating. I'm in a minute's time, we've had a question in about COP27. I'm going to come to you on that and what that means in the climate. But Jerry, the obvious thing that everyone will be wanting me to ask you now is, we'll come on to President Trump, but given this is a surprisingly, on the face of it, good result for President Biden for the Democrats, does this now make it a certainty in your mind that President Biden goes again for 24?
I don't think it makes it a certainty, but it makes it a lot more likely than it looked 24 hours ago. I think many of us thought 24 hours ago, if the polls were right and the punditry was right, and the Democrats went down to a pretty significant defeat last night, losing big in the House and probably losing control of the Senate, given the doubts about Joe Biden, given the fact that his approval rating is pretty low by historical standards, given the question marks about his age, and we've seen a lot of indications in the last 6 months or so that, Biden is, to put it mildly, cognitively slow, and given the fact he turns 80 later this month, I thought we were going to have, if that had happened, if the results had gone as expected, I think the pressure from Democrats to say, look, Biden's done a great job. He won. He beat Trump in 2020. He's not the right man for 2024. We need to look for it. We've got a field of other candidates. We need to look for other candidates. And I think the pressure on Biden would have been strong. I'm not necessarily saying he would have succumbed to it, but I think the sense would have been that it was time for Biden to move on. I think with this result, that changes. Again, I don't think it makes it inevitable that Biden stands up and says, I'm definitely running, and nobody in the party challenges him. But I think, he can reasonably claim, let's be honest, let's be fair, he's held the Democratic losses to a very low number, the best performance by a Democratic president in office in midterms since Bill Clinton in 1998, possibly even better than that. So it's by any historical standards, a strong performance. He can say, I'm the president, who achieved this. I'm quite capable of running again, and I intend to run again. So I think, again, it's not certain, but I think the chances that he will run again have risen substantially in the last 24 hours.
Wow, fascinating.
Just building on that point, if I might, it's rather interesting, isn't it, that there's sort of new, younger generation of politicians are emerging. So Ron DeSantis, I think, Jerry, I'm right in saying, is 44. Rishi Sunak, who's just been made Prime Minister, of course, in the UK, 42 years old, the youngest Prime Minister in 200 years. Emmanuel Macron, of course, himself being in his 40s. It is rather interesting that a whole generation of leaders are coming through.
Yeah, I should say, yeah. I mean, I recently passed that milestone in my life where the Prime Minister and the President of the United States were both younger than me. And we're now getting into dangerous territory where the Prime Minister and the President of the United States could both be young enough to be my child, which is deeply, deeply disturbing speaking. So I'm kind of rooting for Biden and Trump, and at least only from that perspective.
Sorry,
now,
Will.
slightly other thing, well, you mentioned Simon, you mentioned DeSantis, that we really must talk about DeSantis, but I want evidence that when people ask questions, we do ask them. So I'm going to just come out of sync slightly, Simon. We've got a question from Andrew Probert. Thank you, Andrew. Given COP27 is happening simultaneously with this, what does all this mean for the US and global climate agenda? Simon, do you want to just touch on the meaning of COP27?
I think it's a great question and a timely question because, of course, we touched on the the invasion of Ukraine earlier, and of course what's happened now in terms of energy crisis in Europe as a result, and energy crisis really around the world. But so we have the urgent issues in terms of energy supply today, but we've got the critical issue in terms of energy transition for the world. And of course, as people gather around COP27 and talk about the energy transition, how we do meet our net zero goals, while scrambling to find out how to source enough natural gas with a backdrop of extraordinary spikes in energy prices for households, pump prices in the US and around the world. I think that we have this juxtaposition of the critical challenge of the long-term need for energy transition with the short-term crisis of how to source energy and manage the support required to households to meet their energy bills. So I think that it is difficult. We're going to see, I think, a retreat into fossil fuels as we reposition around energy sourcing, which of course makes the longer term goals even more challenging. So I think it is a real issue. I saw in the press this morning the amount of private aeroplanes flying into COP27, which of course seems to be so at odds with the long-term goals. But I do think that it makes even more challenging the critical tasks of energy transition, the priority of managing the impact on climate of what's happening.
Can I just jump in there very quickly, Will? Just to say that one thing we can be very confident of, again, the Republicans look like they almost certainly will have a majority in the House of Representatives, maybe not in the Senate. They've already said this morning, I caught one of the Republican leadership in the House on television this morning saying that they intend urgently to press ahead with essentially opposing the Biden administration's energy policy, which, as you know, has been pretty hostile to domestic fossil fuel production, to try to speed up permitting, to try to basically to find all kinds of ways to increase domestic fossil fuel production, oil, natural gas in particular. So I think, interestingly, you're right. Even though they haven't won the majority they expect, the big majority they expected to, and it was always going to be a priority, they've made it very clear instantly that if they do get that majority in the House, at least, they're going to do all they can, as Simon says, to kind of essentially, if you like, to at least to defer that transition, that energy transition, and to double down on U.S. Fossil fuel production. I think that will be something we'll see now. Biden may be able to block that, but that will be a key point of contention in policy for the next few months.
And just to build on that, Jerry, I think I'm right in saying that China is responsible for 24% of global emissions. And so the big question is, who is actually going to pay for the transition costs in China to affect the global goals? And of course, China itself is not going to pay for it, and certainly not all of it. And so as we end up in a situation with the US and China being increasingly at loggerheads with this dangling question as to how is the Chinese energy transition costs going to be funded, which inevitably is to some extent going to have to funded by other global economies, not just China. The one thing it seems that the Democrats and the Republicans can agree on is their attitude to China. You'll tell me, but it seems to me that there isn't a lot of daylight between how a Republican or a Democratic administration think about the US policy to China. This, I think, is, in terms of the 24% of global emissions coming from China, is probably the most challenging issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
okay.
Again, sorry, and just very quickly, I'm sorry to keep back and forth, but I agree completely. You're absolutely right. Bipartisan policy towards China is pretty much in lockstep right now. If anything, the Republicans might push for an even tougher line. One very, very, very quick point, though, is that I think if the Republicans had won a bigger majority, then some of the aid to Ukraine in its war against Russia, I think, would have been in doubt. The Republican leader has said in the course of the campaign they don't want to keep issuing blank checks. As you know, the US has spent huge amounts of money contributing to Ukraine's defense against Russia under Joe Biden and the Democratic-controlled Congress. Republicans have generally supported that, but have started to question the efficacy of that and the accountability of that. And I think if they had won a big majority, some of that aid would have been in doubt. I think we're now in a situation with a very narrow majority in the House at best, and possibly no majority in the Senate, where I think if the Biden administration wants to continue to support Ukraine, then he will. So you could argue another loser, in addition to perhaps Donald Trump, out of yesterday's election was Vladimir Putin.
Jerry, just to bring you back, because that's fascinating. I want to bring you back to some of the implications of the election more generally. So, as Simon said, it's wheels up in Egypt for people coming in and out for private jets. Does this mean it's wheels up for DeSantis, given the strength of his results in Florida, in terms of an inevitability of him running next year?
Again, we can't say with any certainty. I think, just as I said that, yesterday's results dramatically increased the chances that Biden will run again, I think these results dramatically increase the chance that DeSantis will run. And again, I think there was some question about that 24 hours ago. Look, I mean, everybody expected DeSantis to win. Nobody expected him to win this big. But Donald Trump was the dominant figure in the party. Donald Trump has already said he's going to announce his candidacy for president again next Tuesday. And I think I was thinking yesterday, excuse me, I was thinking yesterday that actually DeSantis might possibly still decide not to run, because Trump is still the dominant figure in the Republican Party, certainly was as of 24 hours ago. This, I think, makes it very hard to see how DeSantis doesn't run. I mean, there's a time and chance, as they say, is everything in politics. You wait and your time is gone. Barack Obama discovered that in 2006. A lot of people were saying you're very young. You can wait. Don't run against Hillary Clinton. And he thought, no, you know what? This is my time. You're really defer. As Simon said, DeSantis is still very young, 43, 44. He could wait conceivably to the next election or the one after. But I think the opportunity now coming out of these midterms is so strong. The momentum he has is so strong. The goodwill in the Republican Party is so strong that it will be very, very, very. It would show a timidity about him if he were not to run. Now, the only caveat I have to say is we're not going to see any immediate move from DeSantis. It would look very poor if he comes out of a huge win in the Florida governor's race and then immediately says, thank you very much, I'm off to run nationally. He won't do that. And also there's a legislative session in Florida, which I think lasts until May, where he'll want to oversee that, sign legislation, get more stuff done, develop more of a record. So I don't expect any formal declaration from DeSantis for some time, but we will certainly get indications in the course of the next few weeks and months of whether or not he is prepared to run, whether he is prepared to challenge Donald Trump. And again, I think that's increasingly likely.
And just to be clear, there's an inevitability to Trump running.
Again, I never say anything is inevitable. I find it hard to believe, as disappointing as many of those results will have been to him yesterday, find it hard to believe, knowing Trump's sense of self-esteem, of self-worth, and his belief, absolute self-belief that he's the right man to run. I find it, and given that he's now teed this up so carefully by saying he's going to declare on, essentially announcing he hasn't said that formally, but he said he's going to make a big announcement on November the 15th. It will be so out of keeping and out of character with this man, who is, as I say, whatever else one may think of him, consumed with self-confidence and self-belief. It would be odd, I think, if he were to now, very odd, if he were not to run next Tuesday. So I strongly expect it. But again, we can't rule anything out.
Okay. And we've had a rather good question, I think, for you, Jerry, from Irving Rotter. Could you comment on the state of polling, which for the second or third election seems to have been quite far off the mark?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I was looking through the final polls last night and comparing them with the result. In a strange way, actually, the polling wasn't that far off. This reminds me a lot, Will, of both the Brexit vote in 2016 and the Trump victory in 2016. The polling in both of those cases was, as you know, very, very close. The Brexit vote in 2016, the final polls had the Remain vote just ahead by a sliver. Same with the 2016 presidential election. The polling had Hillary Clinton ahead by a sliver. And then it was obviously Brexit, Leave won and Donald Trump won. And people said, oh, my God, the polling was all wrong. The polling wasn't that far out. What you got then was exactly the same as you had in the run-up to this election, was polling that showed close races, but a sort of a general mood among the political class, among the pundits, the commentators, the politicians themselves, that things were going in a particular direction. So even though Hillary, as I say, in those final polls in 2016 was maybe 3 points ahead of Trump, which is pretty close by any measure, 3-4 points ahead, organizations like 538 Nate Silver were giving her a 75% chance of winning the election. People were saying it was a 75% chance that Brexit would happen. So the polling was out, no question. I think overall the polling was somewhat out yesterday, but it wasn't dramatically out. If you take races like Georgia's going to be basically a tie. The final polls had Herschel Walker up by half a point there. Pennsylvania, the final polls, average of polls, had it tied. John Fetterman beat Dr. Oz by maybe 2 points. So it wasn't dramatically out. It was within what people think of as a kind of margin of error. But it's absolutely right that there was this, people were over-interpreting these very narrow Republican leads to being a big, big Republican victory. And I think, again, as we look at the polling, and they're certainly going to have to look at where the errors were made, we're going to have to also consider whether or not we sometimes get over our skis by over-interpreting polls that show a slight advantage for one side and interpreting the kind of general mood. Well, this confirms that this is clearly going to go in a particular direction.
Okay. Well, I want to shift gears rapidly now to the economy, because obviously this is a crucial area for discussion. Simon, you talk a lot with CEOs. Multiple challenges for CEOs right now. Could you just highlight what you're hearing about their biggest pain points are to set the scene for us?
Well, I think, Will, the big picture is there are multiple pain points. Now, maybe it was ever so, but the issues are big issues. Coming out of the pandemic, what it means for workforces. Now, obviously, factories and plants have to have people in the plants, but for those office-based businesses, what does a hybrid working environment mean? What's desirable? What's possible in a situation, for instance, where there is still a real labor shortage, and even more than that, an acute skills shortage. So I think skills are difficult to come by, particularly digital skills. So there's the whole workforce challenges, supply chain challenges on the back of the geopolitical issues that we're also familiar with, the facing into economic challenges in multiple economies. Even though obviously we're seeing a quarter in the US of positive economic activity coming out of 2 quarters of negative economic activity, there are multiple issues that CEOs are dealing with. And I think it's the multiplicity of those challenges that's probably most exhausting. And of course, what we're finding is that because of these challenges, it's very, very difficult to plan. And so in many of the conversations we have with our clients, it's around how to remain agile, how to make sure that people don't become a hostage of a strategy that if circumstances change or become very, very challenging in a particular dimension, they can't quickly pivot. And so, for instance, M&A activity has come down on the back of debt being now so much more expensive. But actually, because cost of capital is so high, corporates are looking at how they do divest of non-core assets, how they make sure that their capital works even harder. And those companies with access to capital, have cash on their balance sheets, will have some very special opportunities. So how to run a business to make sure that you're running it for cash, not just for earnings, because there will be some selective additions that can be made to core business strategies that are really beneficial at lower valuations we've seen for quite a few years. So lots and lots of challenges for businesses to think about and can't become hostage of any one particular strategy. And then I'd say on top of that, of course, the challenges for CEOs and businesses nowadays have been accentuated because they have to talk about the purpose of their organization. They have to be able to articulate not just to their investors, but also to their customers or to their employees, their future employees, exactly why the business is purposeful and why they should put their shoulder behind it. So I think the pressure on business generally, but on CEOs specifically, is very, very high.
And of course, the Fed looms large here, doesn't it? And Jerry, you're a highly respected Fed watcher. I think your time watching the Fed and reporting and writing it goes back right to when we worked together at the Financial Times, and you were DC bureau chief. Could you try and explain the current thinking at the Fed? Obviously, everyone will know the actions they've taken recently, but there remains some communication confusion. They say one thing in the statement, then the press conference says other. It creates uncertainty. How are we to understand this?
Yeah, I mean, that is that the communications from the Fed have been one of their big problems over the last year, really, and that continues to be, particularly as you say, in in the light of last week's meeting. Now, of course, they voted again to raise interest rates by another 75 basis points. That's a very, very aggressive for the fourth straight time, a 75 basis point increase in interest rates, which means that interest rates have risen faster this year than they've risen at any point in the last 30 years. But we've seen this very aggressive tightening. The Fed was very late to the game with inflation, dismissed it all the way through last year as transitory. Then suddenly started to realize it wasn't transitory. It's been playing catch up ever since. The problem, again, is not only that they've been aggressive, but there's been this uncertainty about how aggressive they would be. So, as you said last week, the statement, the statement seemed to say, which they issue immediately when they announce the interest rate change, the target change, the statement seemed to say, yeah, another 75 basis points, but we're going to look at conditions. Markets had possibly been expecting another 75 basis point increase in December, not certain, but it was a possibility. So, but the statement seemed to suggest that was probably not going to happen, and that they would ease down to 50 basis points, and also that they would be taking into account, the impact that the interest rate increases already had on the economy, expecting to see some slowing. So it sounded as though they weren't pivoting or even signaling a pivot, but that it was the first real signal that we were getting that actually we might be coming close to the top of the interest rate cycle, and that rates might top out at around 4.5, just over maybe 4.75, 4.75. Then, of course, Jay Powell comes out in his press conference and says, quite surprisingly to a lot of people, at least, that actually rates were going to have to go higher than they expected them to go. Now, the last time they made a formal forecast, the top of the rate cycle was expected to be about 4.5. Now he said it's going to go significantly higher than that, indicating that the rates the terminal rate may end up as high as 5%. So there is this unclarity. On the one hand, you have the statement, which is the view of the consensus of the members, which seems to suggest that maybe they think the rate increases are slowing. Everybody seems to think there will be a 50 basis point increase next month, but that we may not go as high as people feared. And then Powell himself comes out and gives some uncertainty that and says things may go much higher. My own view, Will, frankly, is inflation pressures are still very strong here. Consumer price inflation the headline consumer price inflation has come down from its peak, but core inflation, excluding food and energy prices, is still rising. Last month it was still, the month before it was still rising. We're going to get new data next week on that. It's still very high, over 6%. That's way beyond what is tolerable for the Fed, or indeed for any central bank to achieve economic stability. So I think the Fed is going to continue to be quite aggressive. I think that Powell's remarks suggesting that rates may go as high as 5% is probably closer to reality, because again, the Fed's consensus all the way through the last year has been wrong every single time about how fast rates would go up and how high they'd go. And I think the reality has caught up with them and is still catching up with them. So I think the markets reacted when Powell gave his press conference last week, the market sold off very sharply at expectations that rates were going to go higher than they thought. I think that expectation is still there and is still probably correct, and that rates are probably going to end up, the Fed funds rate is probably going to end up at least at 5%, if not even higher. And obviously that creates very severe financial conditions for the economy, for financial institutions, for financial markets. And so continues to be a factor that weighs on everybody. Again, given that almost everybody now expects there to be a recession, at least in the first half or maybe the whole of next year. So Fed policy still very aggressive, still likely, I think, to induce a recession, and that's probably where people are going to have to assume where the Fed is going to be for the time being.
Well, and given that uncertainty, little wonder then that markets are lacking direction, and this is a source of conversation amongst obviously investors, businesses. We've had a question in from Carl Whitting, which I'm going to put to both of you. I know neither of you are, investor specialists, but the Dow, Carl says, is slightly down today. What do you two see as a longer term direction for markets coming out of these election results? Simon, Jerry, do you want to tackle that?
Well, I'm certainly not an analyst and not an economist, but I don't think these election results on the face of it are going to make a big difference. I don't think the world looks any different today than it looked yesterday in this respect. But I think it's quite interesting to look, for instance, at the different sources of capital, not just public markets. The private equity is sitting on $2 trillion today of dry powder, very, very significant money looking for a home. Now, clearly that money looks for a particular type of return. But I think that we're in a period of readjustment. But I'm not the person to comment on the markets. Jerry, you might have a better view.
I'm not remotely an investment. I'm less of an investment advisor than you are, Simon. Certainly, if my own investing record is anything to go by, anybody who heeded anything I said should immediately go and do the opposite. But all I'll say is, in terms of the current climate, I think the market's off a little bit today. Partly because there was an expectation that Republicans would do better. They would have a sort of solid majority in the House and a majority in the Senate. And it wasn't particularly that the market likes the idea of what the Republicans were proposing to do. But markets, historically speaking, it's a bit of a cliche. They do kind of like gridlock. They kind of like it when one party, when government in Washington is split between control of the White House and control of Congress. And I think that was expectations where that was going to be clearly the case. It's less clearly the case today. So and there is significant uncertainty. Simon was talking about this at the beginning, and I think that is, frankly, from an immediate policy perspective, I think that is that's the big takeaway right now, is that there is real uncertainty. We don't yet know whether the Republicans are even going to have a majority in both houses. They probably have got a majority in the House, but not in the Senate. So we don't know what their policy agenda there will be. We don't know what policies they'll be able to get through with a very narrow majority. We don't know what policies they'll be able to get through, even if they get through, which Joe Biden might then choose to veto. We don't know to what extent this new political dispensation now in Washington, does Biden sit down with the Republican leaders in Congress and say, let's try and get some, fiscal consolidation measures? Is there any common ground on energy? Is there any common ground on regulation? Doesn't look like it. So I think this just heightens the uncertainty, the policy-making uncertainty. As Simon says, I agree. I don't think it radically changes the investing picture, the financial picture, but it just adds to that sense that we really don't quite know policy direction coming out of Washington on the fiscal side for the next year or two.
And so, put another, Simon.
Sorry, maybe Will, just to build on Jerry's point. Now, I think if we take a longer term view, looking back 30 years, it'll turn out to be a sort of a golden age of globalization. China became the shop floor of the world, and this extraordinary economic growth that drove. If you look forward 30 years, you think, well, where is the growth going to come from? Where there isn't another China that's available to give the world economy that turbocharge. Where is growth coming from? And so I think that where that debate often ends up is, well, there'll be innovation in technology that will give us growth in different ways than we can imagine today. But I think the longer term view is quite uncertain.
And just to add, as a very good point, and to add another layer of uncertainty into what CEOs are facing, Simon. Of course, there's the multiple geopolitical tensions, aren't there? We've already touched on China. We've touched on Ukraine. Businesses are still recovering from COVID. Consumers are facing the worst cost of living crisis in decades. I mean, if you're a CEO, Simon, can you prioritize those for us? I mean, which is the one that, if you're running a global organization, is the most challenging? And how should you structure your thinking in order to be able to deal with these multiple layers of uncertainty?
Well, I think the main thing coming out of my conversations with CEO clients is that they realize they can't just focus on one thing at a time. They have to focus on a number of critical things. Let's take supply chain for an example. In a pre-pandemic world where logistics had become so good that really it was just-in-time delivery that governed everything, lowest cost, just-in-time delivery. Of course, the pandemic came along and caused wholesale disruption to global supply chains. And so then it became just in case, not just in time. And so many of our clients had to rapidly develop, in addition to what was left of their global supply chains, regional supply chains and local supply chains to augment, to make sure they were never left out of options, at the same time as dealing with the profound disruption to the labor markets that affected them. And so to your question, Will, I think the main learning to come out of this is that, unfortunately, CEOs don't have the luxury of focusing on one thing at a time. They have to focus on the several things that are key stabilizers and drivers to their businesses. They have to remain agile so that they can pivot at any stage if circumstances change. And of course, those pivots are not just to mitigate the challenges of yet another disruption happening. It's also to capitalize on the opportunities that happen as a result of severe disruptions. It's so interesting. Think about Uber, for instance, the largest ride-hailing business in the world, doesn't own one car. You think of Airbnb, the largest hotel company in the world, doesn't own one hotel. Both of those businesses were born during the financial crisis. So actually disruptions can be good for creating new business models, creating new opportunities. But central to the many conversations I have with our CEO clients is remaining agile is critical to be able to defend against the challenges, but capitalize on the opportunities.
And look, for people watching, the clock is ticking down, so don't hesitate to get your question in. I don't want you going home frustrated that you didn't get to ask our guests your critical question. Jerry, with it being such an unexpected set of results on the face of it, midterms, you've already talked about why it would appear to be a good result for Ukraine, because there was a concern if you were Ukrainian about a stronger Republican result would lead to some diminishment in the result. Good result, good or bad result for Russia, good or bad result for Iran, good or bad result for China?
Yeah, a bad result for Russia, I think, for the reason I said. I do think, again, it wasn't a major threat, but I do think there was much more of a question mark over the scale of US aid to Ukraine if the Republicans had got a big majority. That's clearly not happening. So I think that is bad news for Russia. Iran, I think we're now at the point where Biden has been trying to get this deal with Iran to sort of resurrect a deal to deal with Iran's nuclear program and lift sanctions. He's been trying that for 2 years. Has largely failed. I don't think this changes anything. If anything, again, you have a hostile. You do have a Republican majority probably in the House, which is hostile. Doesn't have a big influence over foreign policy. The Senate remains pretty well the same. So I don't think that changes. Which is, Iran doesn't get significant. There's unlikely to be any significant improvement on that. China, as we talked about earlier, there is a bipartisan consensus now. You've seen very, very clearly a bipartisan consensus to take a very, very tough line with China. That isn't good. That doesn't change as a result of this. I mean, one interesting question. Some people might be trade more generally. Does this, again, a Republican majority in the House, and again, a very small majority Republican split Senate. Does that change the picture on trade? It might do. I mean, the Republicans might be a little more favorable, for example, to a deal with the UK, a trade deal with the UK, which I know Britain is very keen to get. But again, that's got to go through the Biden administration still. So it's hard to see. The Biden administration has been concerned about the Brexit deal and the Northern Ireland Protocol in particular. So I'm not sure there's going to be much there change. So look, I think that, the overall picture in terms of the geopolitics is, with the exception of Ukraine, where I think there is a significant, the result is different from what it could have been. I think, we're going to see the next 2 years very much as we've seen them. And the next big question will be what happens in the presidential election in 2 years' time, and where does that put America in relation to the rest of the world?
Okay, and no news on Arizona as we've been speaking, Jerry. Just to
not that I've seen. No.
But Phoenix is the place to pay most attention to, right?
Yeah, Maricopa County is the big population center in Arizona. It typically is quite close actually, and I think we're waiting to see a big dump of votes from the Arizona counts votes in a very strange way. They kind of just they accumulate lots of votes and they dump them like every 6 or 8 hours over a period of days. So the next one could come any minute, and it will be critical in telling us, how much the Democrats are very narrowly ahead in the governor's race in Arizona and a little bit further ahead in the Senate race. We'll see whether this next dump of votes increases those leads or actually maybe gives the Republicans a chance there.
And you and I may have to reconvene in Phoenix in early February to discuss the ongoing political situation, Jerry. So
I understand there is something going on in Phoenix in early February. I'm hoping it's going to involve the New York Giants, but I'm afraid it probably isn't. But it did last time.
Let's have fingers crossed. I want to end on it's been a fantastic conversation. I've actually learned an enormous amount. You two are fantastic. I think there is an argument that we're feeling gloomy. I know we're not naturally. So let's finish on an upbeat note. What are we feeling most optimistic about? What is there that we feel and business leaders are feeling most optimistic about currently?
Well, let me just jump in on this point. As you know, Will, AlixPartners does this disruption survey every year. We interview 3,000 executives around the world in the major Western economies. We've just actually completed our cycle this year, and the early returns are in. 84% of those 3,000 CEOs around the world are on average feeling optimistic. Yes, they've got multiple disruptions. Yes, they've got multiple challenges. Yes, they know they have to, the majority of them, fundamentally change their business models in the next 3 years. Yes, they're feeling worried that maybe their own jobs are at risk, but fundamentally their businesses, their markets, they're feeling pretty optimistic. 84% on balance of those 3,000 interviews check the box of feeling optimistic economically about the future.
And Jerry?
I think there's actually a potentially very positive interpretation one can put on from a political perspective that one can put on the election results. I do think that voters have indicated yesterday, it's not decisive, it's not dramatic, but I think they have indicated yesterday they're sort of tired of the kind of disorder and chaos and uncertainty of politics in America over the last 5-6 years, since the end of the Obama administration, since Donald Trump came on the scene. And again, I fully understand why people voted for Donald Trump and why they felt frustrated, especially given the alternative. But that period ushered in, there was so much frustration with the existing political order that there was a kind of a sense, look, we'll try anything. We'll try, complete outsider as president. We'll try, and politics became dominated by these outsider figures who said things and did things that were kind of slightly outrageous, maybe some ways successful, but sometimes not so successful. But they were destabilizing, they were chaotic, they were disruptive. And again, disruption can be very good, as we all know, in business as in life. But I think Americans have maybe just had enough of the uncertainty and the disruption. Right. Maybe a little bit, they want to impose some order on the chaos. And those candidates you saw, those Trump-backed candidates, people like, the guy I mentioned in Pennsylvania, Mastriano, all these people who deny the result of the 2020 election, some of these, rank outsiders, people like, TV stars like Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, or Blake Masters, the candidate in Arizona, who is a venture capitalist backed by Peter. These outsiders who came in offering disruption and change and radical departures from what we've seen in the past. As much as attractive as they may once have seemed, I think they're inducing a sense of fatigue in the American people, and they just want to impose some order. And I think, again, I'll finish with Ron DeSantis. DeSantis, the appeal of DeSantis is not only that he's a Republican with a solid record of achievement, but that he does represent some stability. He represents order. He took that very firm line against shutting down the state for COVID. And it was turned out to be very successful economically for Florida. So that whole sense that the country has gone through in the last 5 years with Trump and the pandemic and uncertainty over the economy and inflation, and just this sense that things are spinning out of control. I think their indications are that Americans really, really want someone to kind of return the country to a sense of order and normality and stability. And on the Democratic side, that will doubtless be the case that Joe Biden will try to make. But I do think on the Republican side, that is very much the case that Ron DeSantis can make. So I think there is a lot of optimism actually to be had out of this, that maybe, without suggesting that that we're going to go back to the policies that arguably failed America, we may at least have a chance of moving the country forward, but in a more stable and a more ordered and a less chaotic way than we've seen in the last 5 years.
Okay. Well, look, a fantastic conversation. I've learned a huge amount. Thank you for everyone who has tuned in. Thank you to you, Jerry, and thank you to you, Simon. And look forward to speaking with you all again soon.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you both. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.